My dear friends, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you are standing before a mirror. But this is no ordinary reflection you see staring back at you. Instead, you witness a fractured soul, a being convinced of its own spiritual inadequacy, trapped in patterns of self-doubt that seem to permeate every attempt at growth, every prayer, every meditation session. You have tried countless methods, haven't you? You have sought answers in sacred texts, and the wisdom of gurus, and the silence of retreats, yet something deep within continues to whisper that you are fundamentally flawed, spiritually deficient, perhaps even beyond redemption. This persistent voice has become so familiar that you have mistaken it for truth itself. I am here today to tell you something revolutionary, something that will challenge everything you believe about your spiritual struggles. What if I told you that this sense of brokenness, this feeling of spiritual inadequacy that has haunted your every attempt at growth, is nothing more than an elaborate construction of your unconscious mind? What if the very foundation upon which you have built your understanding of your spiritual limitations is based on a profound misunderstanding of the human psyche? You see, my friends, in my decades of exploring the hidden territories of the human mind, I have discovered that what we perceive as spiritual brokenness is often nothing more than the manifestation of unconscious conflicts, repressed memories, and unresolved psychological tensions that have been cleverly disguised as spiritual deficits. Your mind, and its infinite capacity for self-protection, has created this illusion of brokenness as a defense mechanism against deeper truths that it fears to confront. The very symptoms you attribute to spiritual inadequacy are, in fact, the psyche's way of maintaining a delicate balance between conscious awareness and unconscious material that demands integration. When you feel that familiar sensation of spiritual emptiness during prayer, when meditation feels like pushing against an impenetrable wall, when you sense that divine connection seems perpetually out of reach, you are not witnessing evidence of your spiritual failure. Rather, you are observing the intricate workings of psychological defenses that have learned to redirect your attention away from core emotional wounds that lie buried in the unconscious depths of your being. These wounds, formed often in the earliest years of life, create energetic patterns that masquerade as spiritual obstacles, when they are, in reality, unprocessed psychological material seeking resolution and healing. Before we continue this profound exploration together, I need you to understand something crucial about the journey we are embarking upon. This is not merely an intellectual exercise or another spiritual technique to add to your collection. What I am about to share with you represents a fundamental shift in how you understand the relationship between your psychological development and your spiritual evolution. If you are ready to question everything you have believed about your spiritual limitations, if you are prepared to discover that the very core of your being has never been broken, then I invite you to engage with this material not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in your own psychological and spiritual liberation. Let me begin by addressing a phenomenon that I have observed countless times in my clinical work, yet which remains largely unrecognized in spiritual circles. When an individual experiences what they interpret as spiritual resistance or blockage, what is actually occurring is a complex interplay between conscious spiritual aspirations and unconscious psychological patterns that were established during critical developmental periods. The child who learned to suppress their natural emotional expressiveness in order to maintain parental approval develops, years later, into an adult who struggles with authentic spiritual connection because their psyche has learned to fear the vulnerability required for genuine divine communion. Consider the individual who finds themselves unable to sustain a regular meditation practice, despite their sincere desire for spiritual growth. The common interpretation places blame on lack of discipline, spiritual inadequacy, or divine disfavor. However, the psychoanalytic understanding reveals a far more nuanced reality. This person's unconscious mind may be protecting them from the deep relaxation and openness that meditation requires because such states might allow repressed traumatic material to surface into consciousness. The very act of sitting in stillness becomes unconsciously associated with danger, not because meditation itself is threatening, but because the psyche remembers other times when being still and undefended led to psychological or emotional injury. The resistance you experience is not evidence of spiritual failure but rather proof of your psyche's sophisticated protective mechanisms. Your unconscious mind is not sabotaging your spiritual growth out of malice or inadequacy. It is attempting to preserve what it perceives as necessary psychological defenses against potential re-traumatization. Understanding this distinction transforms your entire relationship with spiritual resistance from one of self-blame and frustration to one of curiosity and compassion for the brilliant, if sometimes outdated, protective strategies your mind has developed. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something that goes to the very heart of our work together. How many years have you spent believing that your spiritual struggles were evidence of some fundamental flaw in your character or soul? How many times have you felt truly heard and understood in your spiritual journey, not judged or given simple solutions, but genuinely seen in the complexity of your experience? I suspect that if you are honest with yourself, the answer might surprise you with its sadness. I invite you to share in the comments below something that you have never felt safe to say about your spiritual journey. Perhaps it is a doubt you have harbored, a fear you have carried, or a question you have been afraid to ask because it might reveal your supposed spiritual inadequacy. Write something like this: Dr. Freud, the thing I have never felt safe to say about my spiritual journey is, and complete that sentence with whatever arises authentically for you. This act of witnessing your own experience without judgment is itself a form of therapy, a way of beginning to integrate the shadow aspects of your spiritual seeking that have been kept in darkness. Moreover, when you share your authentic experience, you create space for others in our community to recognize that they are not alone in their struggles, that what they have interpreted as personal failure is actually a universal human challenge that deserves compassion rather than condemnation. Now, let us delve deeper into the specific mechanisms by which early psychological patterns create what appear to be spiritual obstacles. One of the most common dynamics I have observed involves what I call the abandonment protection complex. This pattern typically develops in children who experienced emotional unavailability from primary caregivers, whether due to depression, addiction, work obsession, or simple emotional immaturity. The child learns to expect that deep emotional connection will ultimately result in abandonment or disappointment, and this expectation becomes encoded in their unconscious as a fundamental truth about the nature of intimate relationships. When this individual later seeks spiritual connection, their unconscious mind automatically applies the same protective mechanisms that helped them survive childhood emotional neglect. The very intimacy with the divine that they consciously crave triggers unconscious alarm systems that work to protect them from further abandonment trauma. Their spiritual practice becomes characterized by approach and avoidance patterns, moments of profound connection followed by periods of inexplicable distance or resistance. They interpret these fluctuations as evidence of divine displeasure or personal unworthiness, never recognizing that they are actually witnessing the psyche's attempt to manage the terror of ultimate abandonment by the divine. The healing of such patterns requires not more spiritual discipline or greater devotional effort, but rather a compassionate exploration of the original wounds that created these protective mechanisms. When the individual can bring conscious awareness to the childhood experiences that taught them to fear abandonment, when they can feel the grief of that young child who learned too early that love is unreliable, then the spiritual resistance begins to dissolve naturally. The psyche no longer needs to protect against divine intimacy because it has processed and integrated the original trauma that made such intimacy feel dangerous. Another profound pattern involves what I term the authenticity suppression complex. This develops in families where the child's natural emotional expression is consistently met with criticism, rejection, or punishment. The child learns that their authentic self is unacceptable and develops elaborate personas designed to earn approval and avoid rejection. These personas become so sophisticated and so deeply ingrained that the individual eventually loses conscious contact with their authentic emotional and spiritual nature. Years later, when this person attempts to engage in genuine spiritual practice, they encounter a troubling phenomenon. Every spiritual technique, every prayer, every attempt at meditation feels hollow and inauthentic, as if they are performing spirituality rather than experiencing it. They may develop what appears to be spiritual perfectionism, constantly seeking the correct way to pray, the proper meditation technique, the right spiritual path, never recognizing that their unconscious mind has generalized the childhood lesson that authenticity leads to rejection. The spiritual seeking itself becomes another performance, another elaborate attempt to earn divine approval by demonstrating spiritual adequacy. The very effort to be spiritual becomes a barrier to authentic spiritual experience because it is motivated by the same fear of rejection that originally necessitated the suppression of their genuine nature. They find themselves trapped in a spiritual double bind where trying to connect with the divine through performance prevents the very authenticity that true spiritual connection requires. Modern neuroscientific research has begun to validate many of these psychoanalytic insights about the relationship between early trauma and later spiritual difficulties. Studies of individuals with complex trauma histories show measurable alterations in brain regions associated with self-awareness, emotional regulation, and the capacity for transcendent experiences. The default mode network, which includes areas responsible for self-reflection and spiritual experience, shows distinct patterns of hyperactivation in trauma survivors, suggesting that the brain literally works overtime to maintain protective vigilance that interferes with the receptive states required for spiritual connection. Furthermore, research into attachment patterns demonstrates that early relational experiences literally shape the neural pathways through which we process all future intimate connections, including our relationship with the sacred. Individuals with insecure attachment histories show characteristic patterns of spiritual seeking that mirror their early relational dynamics, approaching the divine with the same strategies of hypervigilance, emotional suppression, or desperate clinging that characterize the childhood's survival mechanisms. Perhaps one of the most illuminating discoveries involves the recognition that many spiritual practices, when approached without understanding their psychological implications, can actually reinforce rather than heal underlying trauma patterns. Meditation practices that emphasize the transcendence of emotion can inadvertently strengthen psychological defenses against feeling, particularly in individuals whose childhood taught them that emotions are dangerous or unacceptable. Spiritual disciplines that promote selflessness may reinforce patterns of self-neglect in those whose early environment demanded constant attention to others' needs at the expense of their own. This is why a purely spiritual approach, however well-intentioned, often fails to provide lasting transformation for individuals carrying significant unconscious psychological material. The spiritual practice itself becomes unconsciously co-opted by the very patterns it seeks to transcend, creating the frustrating experience of spiritual effort without spiritual progress that characterizes so many sincere seekers. The integration of psychoanalytic understanding with spiritual practice offers a revolutionary approach to these seemingly intractable spiritual obstacles. Instead of viewing resistance, doubt, or emotional turbulence during spiritual practice as evidence of spiritual failure, we begin to recognize these phenomena as valuable communications from the unconscious mind about unresolved psychological material that requires attention and integration. When the meditator notices persistent anxiety arising during sitting practice, rather than fighting the anxiety or interpreting it as spiritual inadequacy, they learn to regard it as their psyche's way of communicating about stored fears or unprocessed traumatic activation that needs compassionate attention. When the prayer practitioner finds their mind wandering repeatedly to worries or doubts, instead of forcing concentration or feeling guilty about mental distraction, they begin to explore what their unconscious might be trying to tell them through these apparently intrusive thoughts. This approach transforms spiritual practice from a performance designed to achieve particular states or experiences into a collaborative relationship with the totality of their psychological being. The spiritual seeker becomes like a skilled therapist to their own unconscious, curious rather than frustrated about internal resistance, compassionate rather than critical about human limitations, and profoundly respectful of the wisdom embedded even in apparently dysfunctional psychological patterns. The development of such an approach requires what I call therapeutic spirituality, a way of engaging with sacred practice that honors both the transcendent dimensions of spiritual experience and the psychological foundations upon which such experience depends. This integration recognizes that true spiritual maturity cannot be achieved through bypassing or transcending human psychology, but rather through embracing and healing the wounded aspects of the psyche that seek integration and wholeness. In my years of clinical observation, I have identified what I call the spiritual compensation syndrome, a particularly insidious pattern where individuals unconsciously use spiritual practices to avoid confronting core psychological wounds. This manifests as an excessive focus on transcendent experiences, enlightenment states, or mystical phenomena while simultaneously maintaining rigid defenses against feeling the full spectrum of human emotion. The individual becomes addicted to spiritual highs as a way of avoiding the necessary descent into the darker territories of their unconscious landscape. Such compensation creates what appears to be spiritual progress while actually reinforcing psychological fragmentation. The person develops an inflated spiritual identity that depends on maintaining distance from their wounded humanity, creating a spiritual bypassing mechanism that prevents genuine integration and healing. They may achieve remarkable states of consciousness during meditation or prayer, yet remain unable to sustain loving relationships or navigate ordinary human challenges with grace and authenticity. The healing of this pattern requires what I term conscious spiritual digestion, a process by which transcended experiences are metabolized through psychological understanding rather than used as escape mechanisms from human complexity. This means learning to ask not just what a spiritual experience means in cosmic terms, but what it reveals about unconscious psychological patterns, unmet developmental needs, and areas where integration is required for authentic growth. When we approach spiritual practice from this integrated perspective, extraordinary transformations become possible. The individual begins to experience their spiritual journey not as an escape from their humanity but as a profound homecoming to the fullness of who they have always been beneath the layers of protective adaptation. The very symptoms they once interpreted as evidence of spiritual brokenness reveal themselves to be the psyche's brilliant attempts to preserve essential aspects of their being that were threatened during vulnerable, developmental periods. The meditation resistance that once frustrated them becomes a doorway into understanding their relationship with vulnerability and control. The prayer difficulties that once discouraged them become opportunities to explore their core beliefs about worthiness and divine love. The persistent spiritual doubts that once tormented them become invitations to examine the childhood experiences that taught them to question their own perceptions and inner knowing. As we draw toward the close of our exploration together, I want you to understand something fundamental about the nature of psychological and spiritual healing. The transformation I am describing does not happen through willpower, spiritual discipline, or positive thinking alone. It emerges through the patient, compassionate excavation of unconscious material combined with the development of sufficient ego strength to contain and integrate previously split-off aspects of the psyche. This process requires time, it requires support, and it requires a fundamental shift from trying to fix what you believe is broken to discovering what has always been whole beneath the layers of protective adaptation. You were never broken, my friends. Your spiritual struggles are not evidence of divine abandonment or personal inadequacy. They are testimonies to your psyche's incredible capacity for survival and adaptation, and when approached with understanding and compassion, they become gateways to a form of spiritual authenticity that transcends anything you could have achieved through spiritual effort alone. Let me address another crucial dimension that often goes unrecognized in spiritual circles, the somatic encoding of spiritual resistance. The body holds memory in ways that the conscious mind cannot access directly, and these embodied memories frequently manifest as physical resistance to spiritual practices. The individual who experiences chronic tension during meditation, persistent restlessness during prayer, or physical discomfort when attempting to open their heart chakra is not experiencing evidence of spiritual inadequacy but rather encountering the body's stored memories of times when opening, relaxing, or becoming receptive led to harm. Your nervous system, with its exquisite sensitivity to danger, may have learned to associate the vulnerable states required for authentic spiritual connection with past experiences of betrayal, abandonment, or trauma. The very act of surrendering to divine presence triggers what trauma researchers now recognize as implicit memory activation, causing the body to prepare for danger even when the conscious mind seeks transcendence. Understanding this somatic dimension transforms how we approach physical resistance in spiritual practice. Instead of pushing through bodily discomfort or interpreting it as lack of spiritual discipline, we learn to regard these sensations as communications from parts of our system that need acknowledgement, understanding, and gentle reassurance before they can allow the vulnerability that authentic spiritual connection requires. The journey I am describing is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile. It asks you to become curious about aspects of yourself that you may have spent years trying to avoid or fix. It invites you to develop a relationship of profound compassion with the parts of your psyche that have worked so hard to protect you, even when their protective strategies no longer serve your growth. It requires you to question fundamental assumptions about the nature of spiritual development and to open to possibilities that may challenge everything you thought you knew about your spiritual path. But here is what I can promise you: when you begin to approach your spiritual journey from this place of psychological understanding and integration, When you stop trying to transcend your humanity and begin instead to embrace it fully, you will discover forms of spiritual connection and authenticity that you never knew were possible. You will find that the divine has been waiting not for you to become someone different, but for you to become fully and authentically who you have always been beneath the wounds and the defenses and the limiting beliefs about your spiritual adequacy. This is why I have created this channel, this community of fellow travelers who understand that true spiritual growth requires both transcendence and integration, both divine connection and psychological healing. If what I have shared today resonates with your experience, if you recognize yourself in these patterns and possibilities, then I invite you to become part of this conversation by subscribing to our community and giving this video a like to help others discover these insights. The path I am describing cannot be walked alone. It requires the support of others who understand that spiritual seeking is not about perfecting ourselves but about discovering the perfection that exists within our apparent imperfections. It requires the companionship of fellow seekers who have learned to hold both their humanity and their divinity with equal reverence and compassion. Your spiritual journey deserves to be witnessed, understood, and supported in all its complexity and beauty. You deserve to discover that your struggles with spiritual practice are not evidence of your inadequacy but invitations to a deeper understanding of the intricate relationship between psychological healing and spiritual growth. Most importantly, you deserve to know that you were never broken, that your mind simply believed you were, and that this belief itself can be healed through the compassionate integration of psychological understanding with authentic spiritual seeking. What I am proposing represents nothing less than a revolution in how we understand the relationship between psychological development and spiritual evolution. This approach recognizes that the modern epidemic of spiritual seeking without lasting transformation is not a failure of spiritual methods themselves, but rather a consequence of attempting transcendence without first addressing the psychological foundations upon which authentic spiritual experience depends. The individual who embraces this integrated approach discovers that their spiritual journey becomes simultaneously more grounded and more transcendent, more human and more divine. They learn to recognize their emotional reactions during spiritual practice as valuable diagnostic information about unconscious patterns requiring attention. They develop the capacity to hold both their spiritual aspirations and their psychological wounds with equal compassion and curiosity. This integration creates what I call conscious spiritual maturity, a state where the individual no longer needs to choose between their humanity and their divinity but discovers instead that authentic spiritual connection emerges precisely through the full embrace and integration of their complete psychological being. They realize that the divine has never required them to be anything other than fully, authentically human, and that their supposed spiritual failures were actually invitations to discover the sacred dimension inherent in their psychological healing journey.